So I did cover some of this in the morning plenary. Of course, I went through it really, really fast. So I'm going to dive a little deeper into it and expand a lot more. I'm going to be talking specifically about the work that we do in child welfare, why we do it, some history, as well as some intervention and prevention techniques that we are using, and how it's something that could be replicated across other disciplines, as well as across other states and counties. So today, I'm going to be talking, as I mentioned earlier, specifically regarding domestic minor sex trafficking. And the reason why I bring this up each and every time I present is because a lot of people will think about what they hear in social media regarding human trafficking and will not be completely certain about what it is, because a lot of what's being shared in social media is a wide variety of human trafficking, from international to local to labor trafficking. And so it can be a little bit confusing until we really get on the same page of what we're talking about. So it really is, I'm going to be talking about what happens here in the United States, what does sex trafficking look like among children, minors, and then what specifically it looks like here in Orange County. It looks similar across the United States than what it does here in Orange County, but I want to make sure that we really understand that it is domestic minor sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation of children, which we use the acronym CSEC. So who are the victims? As I mentioned earlier this morning, these statistics that we have from 2014 are the ones that I have captured through our child welfare system, the number of calls that have come into the child abuse hotline alleging the child has been commercially sexually exploited, which also includes human trafficking. As I mentioned, 100% of the victims identified by law enforcement have had a prior child abuse investigation. And the way that we know that is because in the state of California, we have a statewide database that keeps track of all the child abuse reports in the state of California. So if a child was reported to be physically abused in Sacramento when they were 4 years old, we have that information documented. Or if it was when they were 14 years old in San Diego, wherever they were in California, we have that information in our database for historical purposes. And so that's how we have those numbers. We know that 35% since 2014 are already involved in the juvenile justice system, which means that they are either part of the foster care system. I don't know why I went blank on that one. Foster care system, or they're on the probation system. That is the juvenile court system. So they may be in a foster home, a relative placement home. Maybe they're in the juvenile hall, that type of thing. That the kids that we tend to see, there's 35% of them already involved in the system. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it really is a problem that is hidden. And I think you'll get a little bit of that today from my presentation, and probably what you've heard this morning thus far, is that kids really don't identify as themselves as a victim. Perpetrators are really invested in them believing that the child is making the choice to exchange sex for drugs, choice to exchange sex for money, that they're wanting to do this for the person that they believe that they're in love with. And so it becomes such a subtle process that occurs over time that they just don't see themselves as a victim or realize the victimization that's going on, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, how we have to understand what it is. We have to know what the red flag signs are. We need to know where to look, how to prevent, and how to intervene, because they're just not going to come to us for that. I'm going to show this video. This is an excellent video. If you've been in my trainings before, I see like at least one familiar face that's been in a training before or two. This video, I really, really liked it. As I mentioned this morning, there is a continuum of a child experiencing abuse, in particular sexual abuse, to the vulnerabilities growing up into a situation where they become trafficked. And it's almost really like a recipe for disaster. And it's quite unfortunate, and it's really important for us to understand that continuum of experiencing child sexual abuse or other types of vulnerabilities and becoming trafficked. This video, which I'm going to switch on over to my YouTube because it tends to come off a little bit better if I go straight to YouTube. It's a really great video. It's a survivor by the name of Rachel Lloyd who talks about her experience, and you'll see in this video how she goes from experiencing abuse to then becoming a victim of trafficking and not even realizing it's happening. And here we go. Let me share this.
you're 12 years old and you're living with your moms, and your mom's is struggling because she didn't think that life was really going to work out like this for her, and she doesn't have a man around, and the men that are around haven't always been that great. Sexual abuse is becoming kind of normal for you, and you think that other people don't have secrets that are as bad as you, and maybe you've tried to talk to somebody at school and they haven't really heard you, or maybe they just haven't had time to listen to you. And so you're seeing these girls on the videos, and they're so pretty and they're so sexy, and so your way at 12 of escaping into this fantasy world is to think about what it must be like to be one of these girls, and you know that adult men already look at you, and you wonder how you can kind of use that.
I was just a child, and that's how I was supposed to live, like a child and like an adult.
So one day you're coming out of school and there's a guy outside in a Cadillac, and he's nice looking. I mean, he's got the baseball cap and the jeans and the Timbs, and he tells you how pretty you are, and how pretty your hair looks, and it's been a while since anybody even really noticed anything about you. And for the first time, you feel like somebody's really interested in you, because now all of a sudden he's asking you about your dreams and your hopes and where your father's at, and he says that he can be a daddy to you.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
And so that night he takes you to a club, and he puts you up on the stage, and he gives you a few drinks, and there's men throwing dollars at you, and it's scary, but all the time you're just looking at his face in the back of the room, and he's like, go ahead, baby girl, go ahead, you're doing it for daddy. And you're feeling proud because nobody's ever said that to you. And so then that night he tells you that there's more stuff that you've got to do, and he takes you into a room, and there's a man there, and he tells you to strip, and you think this is something you'll never do, and yet there's a part of you that already knew how to do this, because that's what your stepfather's been doing to you all these years before. And so you turn that trick, and it's like a part of you has died inside. And so you come out of the club that night, and you get in the car, and he's pumping 50 Cent, and he takes you to McDonald's, and he tells you, you did a good job tonight, sweetie. And he's stuffing his pockets with the $1,000 that he made. And right now, you're happy.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
You feel like this is the best that it's ever going to get, and everything else in your life has prepared you for this moment. All the sexual abuse, or the neglect, or the drama, or the pain, or the trauma has prepared you for tonight, where you stepped across a line that you always thought you'd never really quite step across. And you don't realize that night what it will be like to be on the track and get raped. And you don't realize that daddy isn't really going to protect you. You don't realize what it's like to have a gun held to your head that night. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you catch your first STD. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you first come home and daddy beats you for the first time because you didn't make enough money. You don't know what it's going to be like to have cops offer to trade sex with you in exchange for not being arrested. And then sometimes you'll do that and they'll still lock you up anyway. You don't know what it's like to sit up in jail and know that you just made $1,500 for your pimp last night, but he won't come down and put $200 bail on just to get you out a few days early. You don't know what it's like to walk down the street at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're just getting off work and people are starting their day and they see you and they know what you do and they look at you in a way that you just don't feel like you belong in that world anymore. And you don't know what it's like to feel like you've lost part of yourself along the way and to feel like you'll never leave. And no matter how many times you try to leave, he'll always find you and catch you. But that night, all you care about is the fact you're riding in a Cadillac and you're eating McDonald's and you're listening to 50 and you got this one man who you really think loves you sitting right by your side.
So you can see there how she describes, again, that continuum that I spoke about earlier, and how it really, those vulnerabilities when they're in play, how it becomes such a path to a situation that could end up in trafficking. Let me get back to, she speaks of it so well. Again, that's Rachel Lloyd. The organization that she opened in New York is called GEMS. She's an advocate now. I have more information about resources that I'll share at the end with regard to her as well. Okay, here we go. Moving on. So as I mentioned earlier, I want to dive a little bit into some of the laws. I'm going to be speaking about the laws that we have here in California so we have some context around what we're talking about. Want to explain that pimping and pandering is in the penal code in California. When pimping occurs is when somebody knows that the person is exchanging sex for money and receives some or all of the money that they earned for that sex act. That is what pimping is. Pandering is when someone encourages someone to engage in sex acts for money. So maybe they drive them to a location, allow them to borrow their car. They know that it's going on, and then they allow it to happen, or say, yeah, that's a great way to make money. Why don't you do that? So that's what pimping and pandering is. And the reason why I bring that up is because, first, let me get to prostitution, which I talked about earlier. But all of these crimes, pimping, pandering, and prostitution, all go into what human trafficking is. That's why I like to sort of have this foundation. So prostitution, as I mentioned earlier, is lewd. Did I mention this earlier? Well, either way, I'm mentioning it now. Is any lewd acts between persons for money or other consideration. I think I glossed over it quick style because we were in such a hurry. So any person who solicits or agrees to exchange for an act of sex for money could be guilty of the crime of prostitution, except for a child. A child cannot consent to sex. Therefore, a child cannot consent to sex for money. It seems so obvious, right? But it wasn't until 2017 that the laws changed in California. And now we do not arrest children for prostitution, and we should never call a child a prostitute in any place, whether it's in a documentation, if you're a professional that needs to document the work that you're doing with a child, whether you're just talking with friends or reading something in a newspaper, you should be outraged if a child is being called a prostitute, because it just is not true. They are victims, and almost always is it human trafficking. And this is where the pimping and pandering comes into play. So human trafficking of a minor is when you've got the pimping and pandering element, where a child is exchanging sex for money or being encouraged to do so. Automatically in California, it's a crime of human trafficking, which is really, really great. It gives our law enforcement and our prosecution the ability to really treat a child as a victim. But if there is the element of force, fraud, coercion, some of these other things here, violence, duress, menace, which are required for an adult victim of human trafficking, but if that is an added element for a child, then in California, it's a 15-year to life case. So this is where you will see a lot of times our law enforcement will be going for the crime of human trafficking of a child because of the extent of the possibility of time in jail or prison. Whereas rape cases, because oftentimes people will ask, well, what about rape? Why don't they go after, child sexual abuse? People are paying a child to have sex. There's so many different things that have to be proven to prove that the perpetrator knew that the child was under 18 years old. The first off the bat can be difficult to prove. In a human trafficking violation, that does not have to be proven. So we will often see our law enforcement and prosecution really going after the crime of human trafficking. If they can also prove other crimes of rape, child sexual abuse, they certainly will do that. It can just be a lot more complicated. So I just want to make sure that we sort of understand that. And then I want to bring up again the elements of human trafficking per the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is a federal definition. Should we have anybody here that's not from California and that's from other places in the United States, that this is a federal crime here. And these are what is required. The process, means, and end to make that a crime, except means the force, fraud, or coercion for a child when it comes to sex trafficking is not required. And as I mentioned earlier, 41 states and DC all define child abuse under the human trafficking laws here. So there's still some states that are not on board with this, but many, many are. And then if you're not in California, you can go to your local jurisdictions to find out what specifically they are doing. So back again to California, the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act. As I mentioned earlier, that it is commercial sexual exploitation, human trafficking, it's all a form of child abuse. If you are a mandated reporter in California, you should be calling your local child abuse hotline to report that. If you're not a mandated reporter, but you're just concerned, call local child abuse. You can call local law enforcement as well to report any suspicion of child sexual exploitation. It really, really is important for everyone to start approaching children who are being exploited as a child abuse victim. And the laws in California allow us to do so. In fact, direct us to do so. So again, there is a difference between exploitation, commercial exploitation, and human trafficking. And it's important to know that because, again, I mentioned earlier, so many people will talk about human trafficking. I mean, I just did in the beginning, the last 10, 15 minutes, I've just been talking about human trafficking, which is horrible crime. Oh, gosh, this wants me to move along. Okay, which is a horrible crime, certainly. I understand that, and it's very important that we understand what trafficking is and really understand that what it isn't as well. As I mentioned earlier, it's not kidnapping, typically. We don't see it in that form. It's not in cages, that type of thing. But what we also need to not forget about is what is commercial sexual exploitation, because these are often where our start before they on a phone, their friends have a cell phone. And so maybe they start to exchange some sort of sex act for something of value. Or maybe they're starting to be paid to provide pictures of themselves. Anytime money is involved, we have commercial sexual exploitation. If we have child pornography or sharing of child pornography online, that is like our internet crimes against kids. All of it is bad. All of it needs to be reported to the authorities. So we don't only just want to look for a trafficker. We want to consider all of this stuff and all of this being a situation in which a child is a victim of abuse. So now I'm going to step back into history a little bit. History of child welfare and how this has now come to be an issue for child welfare in California. In 2006, the Blue Ribbon Commission was formed to advise the juvenile justice system. And that they formed a group of people together to really make sure the juvenile justice courts were implementing laws and responding to the needs of youth that are part of the juvenile justice system. It was in 2011 that the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force was invited to the Juvenile Justice Blue Ribbon Commission to provide education and information on what the heck is human trafficking? What do we need to be doing? This was in 2011 in California. So we already had started becoming more aware that this was a problem with the children that we work with. And then it was in 2014 when the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force was formed in the way that it is today, which I can talk a little bit more about that. But I also want to let you know that the development of the programs that we have today also really started for us when we had collaborations already in place with law enforcement. We have, for as long as I've been with the county, which is 21 years, we have had a social worker outstationed in every single law enforcement jurisdiction in Orange County. So we already had social workers building relationships with law enforcement. They understand how we operate. We understand how they operate, conducting investigations together. Oftentimes allegations of child abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. There is a child protective factor as well as a criminal factor. Both have to be investigated. And so we often collaborated with law enforcement. And so that has allowed us to continue to collaborate with law enforcement to what it looks like today with our task force. Also, California legislation and laws is what helped us develop programs when it comes to child welfare. And the biggest legislation change was Senate Bill 855 in 2014. Now, there's a lot of words on the page. You don't have to read them all. I'm not going to read them all to you because that'd be very boring. So I'm not going to do that. But what Senate Bill 855 did is it gave county child welfare agencies the ability to create programs, to train staff, to bring awareness to the public, to be able to learn about what is commercial sexual exploitation. It also directed child welfare. This legislation directed child welfare and said, this is a child abuse matter. You are going to be treated in this way, as law didn't change for prostitution until 2017. But because of the Senate Bill 855, we began to view children who are engaging in sex acts for money as victims of child abuse, because we became better to understand it. It also changed some language in our Welfare and Institutions Code, which is the code that drives child protective services in the court system, to be able to bring a child who's a victim of commercial sexual exploitation before the court, so that we could really provide wraparound type services to that child and the family, which I will talk about what that looks like. What that Senate bill also did with giving the counties monies to implement programs is it required us all to have a steering committee, a CSEC steering committee. Our CSEC steering committee here in Orange County is co-chaired by our juvenile court presiding judge. Oh, I left off the word judge. We'll have to add that back in. Juvenile court presiding judge, and our Children and Family Services Division director. So it really, really is helpful to have leaders of a CSEC steering committee that are in positions of influence within their own county. Because when you have people like a judge that's a co-chair of a steering committee, other people will show up for this meeting. And so it's so important to have that, to have them there in that place. And what the committee does is really provides oversight for all the county agencies and partners for us in Orange County, so that we can best serve children that are commercially sexually exploited, or even those at very high risk, because we want to do prevention. We have a few accomplishments in Orange County that I always like to talk about. The Be the One campaign. You'll see the sex trafficking, it's not what you think children are victims to. That came out of our steering committee in the partnership with Orange County Transit Authority. If you live in Orange County, if you've seen bus wraps, that was that partnership that created the Be the One campaign. And then Project Choice is a resource and support drop-in center that we have here in Orange County. Orange County Social Services funds that resource and support center, which I'll talk more about at the end. And then our ongoing work that we're doing, our public awareness and prevention is really working hard at finding a way to bring prevention curriculums in schools. It is not easy. It is not easy, because school districts have their own culture. Some have more parent involvement than others. And parents have a say in what they'd like to see happen in their schools. And so it depending on what a parent's opinion is of human trafficking, they may or may not want that. And also teachers are so burdened already with so much curriculum, adding this in. So it's a challenge, but we're not going to give up on it. We really want to try to bring a really good prevention curriculum to our schools across Orange County. We know that other states and counties are doing the same. Resources and Support Subcommittee is really focusing on how can we connect our youth that we've identified as being commercially sexually exploited and or trafficked, to connect them with medical services as soon as possible. Reproductive health issues that these children often have that other kids their age might not have. If they've had multiple sexual partners, we've had teenagers with multiple abortions. This will affect their reproductive, whether it's their perception of it, how they feel about it, or actual medical issues. We're really trying to get those kids to be seen sooner than later. And then our placement subcommittee is working on ways to how do we support our caregivers taking care of a youth who is at risk of being commercially sexually exploited or who already is. And that goes from the parent themselves, foster parent, to a group home provider, which are now called short-term residential treatment programs. So we are really constantly working towards making things better for our youth that we've identified as CSEC, trying to prevent for the ones that are at risk. It's really kind of an exciting time, actually. But all of this really requires collaboration. In the child welfare system, you have to work with other people outside of your agency. You have to work with community providers to really be successful. I mean, I guess you don't have to, but it's not really going to be very successful. To make it successful, you have to be able to work with people outside of your organization, build relationships. The 24/7 communication is what I have at the top of the list. And really, that's what it's about. Being able to be available 24/7. Now, things don't go on 24/7 every day, 365, but there's a possibility of it. So if you're the type of person that needs to have very, very, very strict boundaries on your work time and your at-home time, I get it. I completely respect it. There's other people that can be a little more fluid with it. We all have different ways that that the work-home life balance works for us and our families and our situations. So really knowing that this type of work with CSEC really is a 24/7 process. Knowing who your partners are, both in your organization and outside your organization, really understanding and supporting their expertise. So when I'm working with law enforcement and I need to understand what their goals are in the work that they're doing so that myself or the social worker working with them doesn't interfere with a criminal investigation, for example, and let's say provides the perpetrator information about the investigation that can completely destroy a criminal case. And then also on the other side, understanding what our requirements are in child welfare is really to try to preserve families and build up families and strengthen families. And while it might look like on the outside that mother or father did a very poor job, we are really in child welfare trying to build up a parent, provide them the resources and services so they can be a better parent, so they can have their child back in their care. And sometimes our goals and missions can cross and not align. But if we understand that and understand the person is an expert and have respect, it's much more successful. It's all about relationships. It really, really is being able to also joke with your counterparts and your partners, to be able to have fun and joke around a little bit, but then be able to get down to business as well. Being patient, attending every single meeting that your collaborative partners are at, because that's where relationships are built. That's where connections are built. That's where learning takes place about what each other does. And it's so important that child welfare does that. In Orange County, what we do to do some prevention and intervention work, and this is required by the Senate Bill 855 that gave us some additional funding to do all this, is we're required to have multidisciplinary team meetings that are specific for our CSEC youth and our kids that are at risk. And it's really to coordinate case management and service delivery, really to focus on the needs of the youth. So in Orange County, we have 3 different kinds. We have our crisis CSEC MDT, and that is what the response with law enforcement looks like in the field. This is a 24/7 response. We have specially trained social workers. If you work in child welfare, if you're in another agency that works in child welfare or a collaborative partner of, one of the things that we really try to do that makes a very big difference is if we get a call of suspected commercial sexual exploitation on the same child multiple times, maybe it happened once, in January we got a call, and then again in May, and then again in September, something like that, we always try to send out the same social worker because the relationship of the social worker with the youth involved is also very, very important. So if you have the ability wherever you're at to connect that youth with the same person, whether it's the same social worker, the same therapist, if the same law enforcement officer can make contact with that child, if there's a current criminal case going on, and there's another criminal case that needs to happen, if it's possible to have the same district attorney involved as much as possible, especially in a crisis situation, if a child sees somebody familiar walk in fact, one of the social workers I supervisor said that. She said that there was this one youth that she often got called out on. And she said, the youth said when she walked in the door, she says, "I'm so glad it was you," which is huge. This youth still struggled, but at least it was a familiar face. And in a crisis situation, if it can be done, it needs to be done. I think back in there, that's our emergency response social worker. That's what they do, contact parents. They help verify the identity of the youth. Who is this person? Again, because of our database in California, and like I mentioned earlier, they've all have prior child abuse investigations. We can find and usually identify a youth, maybe with just the information about who their parent is. They're lying about who they are, but they may mention their parent or their sibling, and we can often identify who they are, which allows us better to provide services. Then we have our initial CSEC MDT. So this is when we newly recognize that a child might be at very high risk or something new has happened to make us suspect that the child's now being exploited or trafficked. We will pull together our expert team of CSEC people in the county to come together to talk about what this youth might need. So we have the social worker, victim advocate, which in Orange County is a nonprofit organization, probation officer, therapist, public health nurse, Department of Education, attorneys, mental health therapist, I said that. Who else is in the room? We're starting to have these more regularly now. These have been really great meetings to pull everyone together to say, oh, I can do this and I can help this child this way. And maybe the services would be best are this, and maybe we have some substance abuse. So what can we do with that? Who makes a better connection with this youth? The CSEC initial MDT has been really quite successful. And then in Orange County, we have something called Grace Court. Grace Court stands for Generating Resources to Abolish Child Exploitation. Grace Court is overseen by the presiding judge of juvenile court in Orange County. It was started by former presiding judge Maria Hernandez. It's currently with Judge Moduiki, and it's an amazing court for kids that are in foster care or on probation. What they do is they have an opportunity to meet frequently with the judge weeks, which I think I have that, makes it unique. Yeah, the judge, when it's not COVID times. Right now it's all on Microsoft Teams. But and there has been some in person actually, but in normal times the judge sits across from the child and just has a off the record conversation. How are you doing? What's going on? It's such a great environment for kids to really achieve the goals that they want. And we are able to have more frequent hearings. In the child welfare system, typical hearings in child welfare about every 6 months. So in this court, in Grace Court, we can do about every 2 weeks to really be checking in on that child. Our favorite team member that we have that I always like to share, we do have a therapy dog. Baxter was our first therapy dog in juvenile court, and he was amazing until he passed away in November of last year. It's wonderful to have a dog in court. It really helps the kids sort of bring down the barriers, make them feel a little bit more comfortable if they're comfortable with dogs. It really helps the staff in court as well, so they have a place to also kind of express some of their feelings or hug a dog, you know, whenever they're struggling. It's been really great. And as I mentioned, Baxter is no longer with us, but now we have Cadence. And Cadence just started end of January. She became officially trained and certified, and she started the end of January, has come to court a couple of times. So it's really a special place. It's a really, really special place. Okay, so now I want to move on to, like, but how and why does this happen to kids? Like, I think you guys are probably understanding that it is a coercive process. Rachel talked about it in the video that we saw earlier. It just happens just like that. More than not, it happens that way. And prior child abuse is so common with these kids, and it's complex trauma. So if you have an opportunity to learn more about complex trauma and trauma bonding, I highly recommend it. I'm just going to touch on it very briefly, but complex trauma is where it's multiple kinds of child abuse over and over, often at the hands of a caretaker. And it changes the way a brain develops in a child. It changes the way that they react to dangerous situations as they grow up. It changes the way they perceive a dangerous situation as they grow up. And then we have trauma bonding. And trauma bonding is that strong emotional attachment between the abused person and the victim, or the abuser and the victim. And they have that connection, like Stockholm syndrome. If you're like old like me and been around a while, you probably heard about that. We really refer to it as trauma bonding now in the mental health profession. It's that connection, because they often want to be with their abuser. And what I found with these two things, complex trauma and trauma bonding, is that if a child has experienced complex trauma, and now that they're involved, let's say 15, 16 years old, and they're involved in a relationship with somebody that's abusive. They were abused as a child at the hands of a caretaker. They're now in an abusive relationship with a boyfriend who's forcing them to have sex. And again, the force may be more like coercion than physical force, although often violence is part of it. It very much mirrors what they're experiencing with now the relationship that they believe that they're choosing to be a part of, very much mirrors what they experienced as a smaller child that was abused. And so it can be very confusing and actually very comforting. Like, this is what they know. So it can be very difficult for us to intervene, although we have to try. We have to understand this. And I really, really like the way that our former presiding judge Hernandez, how she said it, where she said, oops, let me go back. Hold on. She says, their stories are of deprivation and alienation. They have been beaten and branded, sexually assaulted again and again. day after day, whose understanding of love is as twisted as the minds of the pimp who owns them. These stories result in children whose sense of survival demands that they view everyone with distrust, suspicion, and defensiveness. Supporting them means getting past the aggression and anger, not hearing or at minimum not being personally offended by the F-bombs, and to see the child for who he or she is, a child who has survived unimaginable trauma. So it's really great how she really sums that up. Okay. So now I want to show again, as I showed this morning, the voices of trafficked youth. Again, this is where if we don't prevent, if we don't intervene sooner, this is the kinds of things that they're saying. So I think every time, for me, every time I see it, it is just as powerful every time. It almost kind of tells a story, I think, in the way that they come up. It's all different kids that have said this. All of these are quotes said to a social worker after they've been located by law enforcement. And you'll notice I always say located by law enforcement, identified by law enforcement, because we don't use the term rescue with this population. Because when you think of rescue, when you're rescuing like a dog, right? I follow all kinds of like dog rescues, which is so awesome. And the dogs are so excited. Well, sometimes they're scared at first, but they're excited, or rescuing somebody from a fire, or that type of rescuing. People are pretty excited to be rescued. Not these youth. They're not. They're in love with the person. They have that trauma bond with the person. They want to be with them. And so we have to really make sure language is so important, as I mentioned, for so many reasons. Because if we have the language in our minds of what our perception is regarding that language, that's how we may treat the person. And so we really want to make sure that if we're talking about rescuing, that we're probably not going to get huge thank yous from them. And so maybe instead we have to think of it another way. We've identified, we've located, and now we're trying to intervene or prevent or provide services. There's a bunch of things in chat here. So let me see if we have any. I think I just kind of, okay, just see some comments. I'll look again in a moment, but let me move on. Okay, so now I want to talk about how to work with this population. And this is whether you're in a professional capacity or volunteer, or you just find somebody that you're noticing is having some issues. How do you work with them? The victim-centered approach is part of this approach. It really aims to ensure that we're treating somebody like a victim and not a perpetrator of a crime, that we are non-judgmental, very sensitive in the way that our approach is. We do not want to re-traumatize. So really it's about empowering the person that we're working with, understanding that they need support in a way where they lead, they take the lead in what they need. That we don't come upon them and decide what they need, but really that we understand that they are a victim of a situation. And then trauma informed. I often use these things interchangeably. They are slightly different, but they're similar as well. Trauma informed is really understanding the impact of their trauma. So not just a traumatic situation that when they were being exploited or trafficked, but also considering prior trauma is coming into play here. Prior complex trauma, abusive situations, really realizing that has changed how their brain developed and how they're reacting to situations. And again, it's non-judgmental, it's meeting them where they're at, it's allowing them to take the lead. We can only do so much of allowing a child to take the lead because they are still children, but at the same time, it's validating their feelings, emotions, and thoughts. So really coming from that approach and working with this population is so very important. And I have this slide here. I entitled it screening questions because that's what they are. But this is a way that you can engage a youth in sort of a trauma-informed, victim-centered way, rather than coming at a child with, well, did you have sex for money, or who paid you to have sex, or something like that, or who's your pimp? Because that can be very off-putting. So instead of doing that, it's really having a conversation with the youth. I really, really, really like the last bullet point in particular, which says, basically it's like, hey, kids, sometimes get in bad spots. They need help. They need to get by. They need something. Either they want something or they need something. Have you ever had to, exchange a sexual activity for what you needed? And I really like it because it comes across not judgmental. It's a conversation. And if they say yes to that question, yes, I have, that has told you everything about the situation this kid has probably been in. And now we know what we're working with here. Like, okay, we've got a whole lot more people that we need to engage, get our collaborative partners together. We've got to be doing some work here and know that the child may not want it, but now we have that information and know better to work forward. When we use this kind of language and use these kind of questions and screening tools in particular, they really do work. And I've taken this from Heidi Olson. She's one of the speakers at Ensure Justice this year. She spoke last year. I took this from the information that she's presented on before at Children's Mercy. She's a leader in the healthcare realm when it comes to this type of stuff for CSEC and human trafficking. And she said when they weren't using a screening tool at her hospital in 2015, they only identified 2 kids. But when they started using screening tools in 2019, they identified 62, either already trafficked or at very high risk. And that's what we want to do. That's what we really want to do. We really want to be able to identify youth sooner that are in that situation. I can tell you that CHOC here in Orange County is working towards that. They're not there yet. We are really on the cutting edge in a lot of ways of this in the United States. 2014, I mentioned the laws changed here in California with that legislation. And it's really across the United States about this time. We are where domestic violence was way back, what was that, in the 80s, when it was starting to really become understood, that cycle of violence. We're kind of there in the beginning stages. So there's going to be some places that are light years ahead. I can tell you our Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force and our law enforcement are really, really good at understanding victim-centered and trauma-informed and working with victims, especially minors. But there's some law enforcement agencies that are not, including some here in Orange County. There are some service providers that don't understand. There's some that are amazing and you don't want anyone else to work with a child because they're so good. So we're kind of, everyone's working towards it though. Teamwork is so important. That's what I keep mentioning, kind of the string throughout this. How do you work with CSEC in the child welfare system? It takes a team. This is our professional team that we have in Orange County. This is just some of the people. We've got social services, district attorneys, law enforcement, Salvation Army, Waymakers, all represented in this photograph here. Baxter, when we had him, is there as well. And this is our professional team that we have. There's so many more people part of the team. And the other people, oh, this is us. I forgot I did that animation. This is us. It's awesome. We're very lucky to have this. It can be done in other places too, if you get the right people, of course, like I mentioned. And it does take a village. It takes not only the professionals that I showed you in the last slide, but all of these people here. We've got some professionals, but we also have some community providers, some faith-based organizations. We have volunteers. Everybody is represented in these photographs here. This was part of the Be the One campaign. Look at, we have a pregnant, that was one of our victim advocate supervisors. She's even getting her little one, not even out yet, to be an advocate and support and understanding of this issue. So it does take a village. It takes so many. Awareness is a great place to start. We are so lucky that we have across the United States, we have Strike Out Slavery. It started with it says LA Angels, huh? But LA Angels of Anaheim, I think, is the official. Anyways, such a weird thing to see LA Angels. Even though I knew it was there the whole time. So the Angels is really where Strike Out Slavery started. It's amazing that we have the support of Major League Baseball now in 2019. 2020 was kind of weird. I think there was some talk of Strike Out Slavery. I was following it. I was trying to kind of keep up exactly what they were doing, but no one could be in the stands. I mean, 2020 was kind of a mess for everybody. So Awareness is a great place. Strike Out Slavery. If you find this is going on in your city, across the states, when we're able to get back into the stadiums, share this, because it can start with awareness. Again, as I said before in the last presentation, prevention though, we really, really need to start with prevention in schools, in maybe churches or community organizations where kids are. If we can start educating children, middle and junior high school age, especially, that's a great place to get in before they're in high school and they're already starting to be groomed by an exploiter or trafficker. We really want to teach it in ways of teaching a strong and healthy relationship. So we're not going to come into a school and be like, this is a pimp and this is what sex trafficking is. And I mean, that's going to freak a lot of people out. I mean, parents really, probably not kids, but freak out parents. It might freak out some kids. It will freak them out. So you can't come across that way. It has to be more about promoting healthy relationships. What does that look like? And not just relationships in a romantic sense, but friendships as well. What should your friend be asking you to do or not to do? What's that like? And then targeting the population that's really most at risk, but really all kids need this, right? Because of the online presence of groomers, pedophiles, traffickers. They're online looking for kids who have a vulnerability. And a vulnerability could even be that the child wants to be a singer or a model, and they're posting these pictures. And then you have somebody come in. We have a survivor that we've had come and speak with us, and she speaks in a lot of different places. Her name is Rachel Thomas. And she was recruited as a young adult in college to be a model. And that was the beginning of her human trafficking situation. So it can happen at any age. And it can be, and she came from an upper middle class family as well, intact family. I think mom was a lawyer, dad's a doctor. I mean, really, really great foundation that we try to provide our own kids, but she was off to college and it happened to her too. As I mentioned, when things seem like really overwhelming, like, oh my gosh, how can I do all this? Can I bring a curriculum? Well, maybe you can talk to your school district if you have influence, if you know people, your PTA, and talk to your school district. Hey, what are we doing about prevention curriculum in schools? Or start volunteering for an organization. But to simplify it, to make it like not so big, if you need it to be a little bit more easier to take, is again, just to be a safe and stable, trusted adult in a child's life, somebody they can come to and share something with if something bad is going on, or, oh, somebody said this to me online. What does that mean? Teaching our kids about online safety, and not just about not sharing your address and where you live, because that's basic. The kids are getting that. I have a 10-year-old daughter, she's got that in school, but also not sharing vulnerable information online about their feelings about a situation, their bad feelings about a situation, that type of thing. I have these resources. I do believe these slide decks are going to be available. These are excellent resources that I always like to share. If you want to learn more about human trafficking, you can read these books. Rachel Lloyd was the person we saw in the first video. Carissa Phelps, Rebecca Bender, they're all survivors. Linda Smith with Cindy Coloma is also a really excellent book. I've read all of them. They will all talk about situations in their childhood that you will see the vulnerability that was there and what was going on in their childhood that maybe if intervention could have happened. I really like Runaway Girl by Carissa Phelps, because she actually, what I like about her book is there was a teacher in juvenile hall that really supported and praised her for being very smart in math, very, very smart in math, and challenged her in her mathematic abilities and didn't look at her like a criminal, and how that made all the difference. And really planting seeds with our youth that are in vulnerable situations to know somebody cares really can make that difference in the long run. Websites, I always recommend the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force, since County of Orange Social Services is part of that as a partner. The Polaris Project runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They have a lot of really good information and resources and myth debunking on their website. Shared Hope International does a lot regarding juvenile sex trafficking. Linda Smith is the one that started Shared Hope International, and they have great information. They actually are the ones that have the report cards for each and every state in what they're doing when it comes to commercial sexual exploitation of children, and how they rate, what the laws are, what needs to change, what they're implementing. So Shared Hope International is great for that. You guys all know the Global Center for Women and Justice. That's why you're here, the Ensured Justice Conference. And then the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I really direct people to these websites because this is where you're going to get accurate, factual information instead of sensational headlines. And then, of course, we all love Dr. Sandra Morgan. And I have to always put out her podcast if you want to listen to more about human trafficking, all kinds of human trafficking, international, local. She's got it all there. I mean, you guys, I don't need to sell Dr. Sandy Morgan on you guys. And of course, we always want to listen to survivors. So I know we started a couple minutes late because I had some technical difficulties, but that ends my presentation, and I'm going to try to get over to the chat and see if there's anything there. But again, this is set up in a meeting mode. You don't have to you don't have to go on video if you don't want to, because this is being recorded and will be put up. But if you want to take yourself off mute and ask me a question, you're more than welcome. And I'm going to kind of look over to the side and see if I have questions too. Okay, here's a question. If a youth discloses to you that they have participated in survival sex, what would be a lay individual's next steps to get them assistance? I would call the child abuse hotline. As a lay person, you can call the child abuse hotline anonymously. We prefer that you provide your name and contact information, because reporting parties have information sometimes that don't always get translated to the investigating social worker. It is always confidential. We can never disclose who the reporting party is. So that if it's a minor, it's a child abuse report. If it's an adult, we have resources here in Orange County that can help. Waymakers would be well, Waymakers doesn't do survival sex, they do human trafficking. So you would want to look in your local area what organizations help victims of commercial sexual exploitation. That is what survival sex is. So who do we have in your organization? In Orange County, we have Project Choice, which is a social services contracted agency. They do amazing work for at-risk also. And then we have, thank you, Sue, for this too. Sue and I, we know each other too. I'm so glad you're here. I once had a foster youth who had run away from her home, tell me she had sex with a guy so he would let her sleep in his garage. I just worked to re-engage with her and her foster parent and social worker, but what should have been done more? You know what, since she was already involved with the foster system and had a social worker providing them that information, the social worker is a mandated reporter. They would need to call in a child abuse report on that. You know, this population is tricky because while we help and intervene, then there's going to be some relapse, I should say, or regression on the child. And they're going to go back to a situation, and then we have to intervene and try to prevent again. And it sometimes can be like a revolving door. It can be frustrating. So you really have to know that you can be okay with sometimes some disappointments, that it takes a while for our kids to really get it. That's that complex trauma. That's the change of their brain. That's the trauma bonding that they have. That's the, I'm not a baby. You know, I can survive on my own. I don't need you guys to take care of me. I can handle it myself. I'm choosing this. This is all the brainwashing thing that's happened to them. So it's just us continuing to show up for them, be there every time they need the help, answering the phone, but doing it as a team, because if it's all on one person, you will burn out. So you need to have that supportive team in place. And it sounds like you did that, Sue, with having, you know, contacting the foster parent and the social worker and just doing what you can do to connect to resources and services the best that you can. And we just keep showing up for these kids. Eventually it makes a difference. Any other questions? It's 2:45 right now. And I know we have a full day and tomorrow too. So if you need to hop off and take a break before the next thing, no problem. I'm kind of checking over the chat again just to make sure I didn't miss anything. I think that's it. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate the nice comments off to the side. It's off to my side. So I really appreciate that. Oh, there's a new message. Yes, you're welcome. You are all very welcome. My information is in, what's it called? Wevo? Wovo. I don't know what it is. This is all new to all of us, right? You can also search my name, Nicole Stratman. My LinkedIn comes up as well. So you're more than welcome to reach out to me if you'd like more information. I see Hans there. Nice to see you, Hans. Thanks for coming. I think it's your second time you got this from me, probably. Nice to see some familiar names. I appreciate the support. And more than happy to if you want to reach out to me on the Wevo thing, whatever that is, I'll answer questions there too as well. And then I'll be doing a networking session tomorrow. I'm going to be facilitating a networking session tomorrow on the social services side of it. I think with Derek and I are. So anyways, enjoy the rest of the conference.
I just want to say real fast, thank you so much, Nicole. This was so informative, such important information for all of us to hear. So thank you so much for your presentation. It was amazing. Thank you everyone for joining the workshop. Apologies again for the wait. Thank you for your patience. A year later, and we're still working on some Zoom technicalities. You know, it's a growing process, but yeah, thank you everyone so much. There's a break now until 3 o'clock for anyone sticking to the agenda for the conference. The next segment is Survivor-Informed Strategies in Ending Human Trafficking, which you can find on Whova. The link to that, everything, all the information should be on Whova. So yes, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Desiree. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.